Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we talk about OpenStack with Tytus Kurek. Tytus is the product manager at Canonical, the publishers of the popular operating system Ubuntu. He is responsible for developing and maintaining product roadmaps for OpenStack and Kubernetes. He has been working in the IT industry for 10 years, leading complex projects involving numerous cutting-edge technologies, NFV, OpenStack, Kubernetes, and others. He holds a PhD in cloud computing and has a Master of Science in telecommunications. So welcome to The Cynical Developer.
Hello, James. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, not a problem. It's a topic that we've not really spoken about before, I don't think. We've often talked about in passing things like AWS and Azure and GCP and things like that, but this is something new. It's something I definitely wasn't aware of initially, and I think it'd be quite interesting because I think it fills a niche in the market that I'd never really even thought about. So I'm quite interested in finding out quite a lot more about it today. So the topic that we're here to talk about, or the technology, is called OpenStack, and that can be found at openstack.org. But what is OpenStack?
I can't believe you haven't spoken about OpenStack in this podcast, because it's been available for 10 years, and it's kind of a building block behind private cloud implementations nowadays. But getting back to this question, what is OpenStack? I don't think there's a single answer or definition. It really depends. Whoever you ask is going to provide a different answer, because OpenStack means various things for various people. It means an open source project. It means an open source community. But what is it actually about? So let's have a look on how modern ICT infrastructure look like. It is fully based on a cloud architecture that's utilizing virtualization technologies, software-defined networking, software-defined storage, and all of that results with distributed compute, network, and storage resources that have to be managed somehow to provide the actual value to the end user. So now imagine that this software can either be a proprietary one or an open source one. If it's an open source software, one of such an implementations is OpenStack, and a platform that is managing all of those distributed compute, network, and storage resources can be either implemented using some proprietary software or an open source one. If we have a look on the most popular open source implementation of such a platform, it is OpenStack.
Okay, so you said that it's like the building blocks for all modern cloud computing. Is it what's used by a lot of the public cloud, or is it just something that they've based their technology on? So,
in order to answer this question, we have to get back in a history to even more than 10 years ago, when Amazon Web Services have become initially available. So Amazon Web Services were like a first implementation of a cloud platform that was available on the market, but they had one serious limitation. They were a public cloud implementation, while many organizations were still willing to implement their own private cloud infrastructure instead of just relying on an external vendor. So this is where OpenStack came into the game, trying to implement what Amazon Web Services were doing in public cloud in the form of a software that would be available for everyone, so that everyone could build their own private cloud based on the same architecture that was used by Amazon Web Services. If you ask me about what software is actually being used by the leading public cloud vendors, they usually have their proprietary architecture. However, there are still some public cloud providers like Rackspace, for example, who base their public cloud implementation on OpenStack. So it can power both private clouds, but it can also power the public clouds.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that clears up a little bit of confusion I've had for a little while. And through my ignorance, I've not bothered to even go and look it up. I would always look at places like Rackspace that would say, "Oh, we have our own private cloud," and I was thinking, "Well, what's that?" So it's obviously this sort of implementation, and as you say, it is this exact implementation.
Right. They provide both public and private cloud, and it's all based on OpenStack.
Yeah, so we mentioned they're public and private clouds. What's the difference between them? Is there a difference? Is it just a naming? Why are there public and private clouds?
It's a good question. So many people think that the difference between public and private cloud lies in where is the cloud actually run, whether it's running on customers' data center or like on customers' premises, or whether it's running in a data center that's owned by the vendor. While in fact, the difference is actually somewhere else. The difference is in who uses the cloud, whether a cloud is only available for this particular customer or it's shared between multiple tenants. So this is really what defines whether the cloud is private or public. If it's a private cloud, it's only available for this particular customer. This customer owns the cloud. While if it's a public cloud, then it is hosted by a vendor and multiple customers can use the resources provided by this cloud. So there are still private clouds that would be hosted by a vendor in a vendor data center or in a data center of a vendor's partner that would be still a private cloud. So the difference is actually somewhere else than what many people think.
Sure. So the difference there is that it's a bit like shared hosting. Is that with a private cloud, all of the resources are yours on within that cloud. On a public cloud, you will have other people competing for those resources or using those resources as well.
Right. So it's like having an office in your house or renting an office in a big building.
Yep. So what are the benefits of using OpenStack over some of the competitors, such as VMware?
So if you have a look at what VMware provides nowadays, it's so-called VMware vRealize suite, which is actually more like a virtualization platform than a fully functional cloud platform. So before we move on, let's stop here for a while. So what does cloud actually mean? Is it not just about the virtualization? So in fact, cloud is something more than just a virtualization platform or a virtualization layer. It abstracts all of those distributed compute, network, and storage resources, and so that users are not aware of what's actually happening behind. So that users are not actually aware of what's happening beyond. And the value that the cloud brings is provided to the user in a form of a service that's available from a kind of a self-service portal. So user can log in, click a few things on their dashboard, and they can get those resources on demand. Cloud also implements so-called pay-as-you-go billing. So the user actually pays for as many resources as they are consuming. It is multi-tenant, it is highly available, it is resilient against failures, very often implemented using some geo-redundancy technologies. So this is something that VMware, we realize, does not really provide. And this makes them more like a visualization platform than a fully functional cloud platform. But there are some other differences between VMware and OpenStack, which translates to the benefits when users choose to use OpenStack instead of VMware. And those come from facts like VMware is a proprietary software. It requires a license to be used before you can even start. And this license is usually very expensive. So it may be a significant blocker for various organizations. It also significantly impacts a TCO associated with operating this environment post-deployment. Another aspect is that a VMware is delivered by a single vendor. It's just VMware who maintains their software. There's no like a broader community compared to OpenStack, for example. And all of that results with vendor lock-in. So users cannot they cannot contribute. They cannot apply patches by themselves. They cannot bring new feature requests. They cannot solve the bugs by themselves. They always have to apply kind of workarounds. They are fully dependent on a vendor. Moreover, VMware provides just a limited set of technology choices, including hypervisors, SDN solutions, and storage solutions. And those include ESXi hypervisor, NSX, SDN. Those are all VMware proprietary solutions. And the storage can only be a local one or a SAN. So as you can see, there are many benefits of using OpenStack over the competitor offering like VMware. And actually over years, it's been concluded by various organizations that OpenStack is going to become a de facto standard for cloud platform implementation.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It is very different to the VMware stuff, as you say. That's more about virtualization than what is offered by OpenStack. But what OpenStack offers, I can get from Azure, GCP, and AWS. Why would I choose to use OpenStack over one of the big three, or is it even comparable?
I think it is comparable, as both public clouds and private clouds basically deliver the same value to end users, which is a kind of a platform that's responsible for the overall management of the resources available in a data center. But it's always a good question whether you should go with a public cloud or whether you should go with a private cloud. And it really depends on the size of your workloads that you are going to deploy. So if I was about to deploy a simple web application today that would host my personal website, I would definitely go with a public cloud, with one of the leading public cloud providers, rather than implementing a private cloud on my own. But over time, it may actually turn out that it's cheaper to invest in a private cloud than running thousands or hundreds of thousands workloads in a public cloud. So actually at Canonical, we believe that the price performance is the only motivation behind the private cloud implementation, as in long term, it's always more efficient to run a private cloud instead of hosting all of your workloads in one of public clouds.
Yeah, so managing running your own cloud seems like a lot of work, especially if you're only running a small setup. Because one of the beautiful things about going to one of these public clouds like Azure or Azure is that you don't need the expertise and the skill set in managing the hardware, because that's managed for you. But you're bringing that back in. You will be having to manage that hardware again in a private cloud, because it's all the virtualization is over your own hardware. So you're taking a step back to how things used to be. if I can say that without getting shot down, where you buy your hardware and you set up your cloud on it. But the cost must be quite high, because you've probably got to have a large server or large servers with a lot of space. So if you're doing something small scale, I would assume that running your own private cloud with OpenStack is probably not the best solution. But if you've got a huge setup that is costing you a lot of money to run on a pay per usage basis, then the private cloud with OpenStack would be the right option. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, it's exactly the case. So it all depends on the scale, and it all depends on for how long your workloads would be running. If the scale is small, a public cloud is always a better option, while once the number of workloads grows, and if you're supposed to run those workloads for months, for years, then it may actually turn out that it's more cost effective to run those, to invest in a private cloud, even if it includes investments in hardware and dedicated operations team that would be needed to operate this cloud post deployment. It may turn out that it's more cost effective to run those workloads in a private cloud. So it all depends on a scale and a time frame.
Sure. So we talked about OpenStack and the fact that you need your own hardware and you are building your own cloud. Does OpenStack provide any sort of multi-cloud infrastructure? So could I go and integrate with my AWS services? Could I bring them into my own OpenStack environment?
So OpenStack itself does not really provide any tool like that. However, there is a rich ecosystem of tools around OpenStack that are providing this kind of functionality. And obviously, we are living in the multi-cloud market times. So at Canonical, we talk with various customers who are running their workloads both in public clouds and private clouds. Some of them are running their workloads on top of OpenStack. The other ones are running their workloads on top of Kubernetes. And everyone is looking for a multi-cloud solution that would combine all of those infrastructures. So an interesting solution that here at Canonical we believe is going to bridge those gaps is Juju, which is a multi-cloud SaaS platform that allows to run workloads on a variety of cloud providers and interconnect them even over a network so that they can function as a bigger service that provides a value to the end users.
Sure. It's always something that's amused me, the term multi-cloud, because you speak to a lot of people about cloud computing, cloud hosting, and all this sort of stuff, and they tell you, yeah, it's always available, it never goes down, it's fantastic, but in case it does go down, you don't want to just be in GCP, you need to be in AWS, and you need to be in Azure as well. Is that one? Well, I thought it was always up. You just talked to me there about 5 nines and 6 nines and 7 nines and things like this on uptime, and now you're telling me I need to pay somebody else some more money to put my infrastructure there as well. So I've always found that quite amusing.
Yep.
But the website for OpenStack claims it's faster and cheaper to run. I may be butchering the words there, so if I am, I apologize. But what is that in relation to? Where are the cost savings?
As we discussed, moving to a cloud platform is actually driven by economics in most of the cases. Like historically, users were maintaining their so-called pets infrastructure, where every bare metal machine was treated by them in a dedicated way. Like those servers have to be available all over the time. They had to be upgraded manually and so on, while the cloud approach is completely different, where the workloads are actually treated as so-called cattle. So when you create a new service, you deploy a bunch of virtual machines that will be providing the required services. If it happens that one of the units fails, you can just terminate this unit and provision a new unit of the same application. So all of that results with an improved agility and allows people to deploy applications and operate them much faster compared to how they used to do that a couple of years ago. And also, as all of those resources cannot be shared across a number of hosts that build a cloud, this actually results with cost savings as well. So it's always cheaper to maintain a cloud infrastructure than the legacy PEDS infrastructure, because first of all, you usually need less hardware. And second of all, it's cheaper to operate a cloud infrastructure than a legacy infrastructure.
Sure. So those two rather large points there are it's faster and it's cheaper to run. Is in relation to on-prem stuff where you've got your own bare metal servers and that. This isn't in comparison to other public cloud providers. So that's good. That clears that up for me. Now we've talked and sort of mentioned a little bit about provisioning services. With OpenStack, are you able to provision stuff like Docker containers, functions, VMs, all those things that you would expect from the public cloud providers?
There is a bunch of OpenStack projects that provide this kind of functionalities, and those include OpenStack Magnum project and QueenLink for the functions, as you mentioned. But you have to remember that the open source community works in a different way than the huge public cloud provider like AWS, for example. So most of those projects are in the incubating phase, and they are not production grade. They are not ready for deploying them in production. As a result, here at Canonical, we believe that what works better is combining various technologies that provide the best possible end value for the users. And as a result, we rather promote solutions like Kubernetes, for example, for the container coordination. And you can very easily combine Kubernetes with OpenStack, where OpenStack is basically managing all of those distributed compute, network, and storage resources. And it's acting as a kind of a cloud operating system, while Kubernetes runs on the top and provides the container coordination and container orchestration capabilities. So instead of relying on incubating OpenStack projects, which are not really ready for using them in production environments, we rather rely on combining the best possible tools that are already available on the market to provide a unified infrastructure stack that allows combining both virtual machines, containers, and other types of resources.
Sure. So something that gets touted about cloud computing is infrastructure as code, and you can do that through many different means. Terraform is quite a popular one. Does OpenStack support Terraform, or does Terraform support OpenStack? Maybe is the better way around.
Yeah, I think it's a better question. So Terraform obviously supports OpenStack, as it supports leading infrastructure providers as OpenStack, Kubernetes, and the other ones. So we can obviously use Terraform with OpenStack, but this is actually not the only solution that you can use to provision resources on top of OpenStack. I know it's quite popular, but there are other open source projects which are very interesting too. So first of all, OpenStack comes in with Heat project, which is a built-in OpenStack service that provides orchestration capabilities. But in fact, the biggest challenge is not about the resources provisioning, but operating those resources after the deployment. So let's say we're deploying a bunch of instances on top of OpenStack that are hosting some application services. It's really not that difficult to provision those instances. The actual question comes around how are you going to operate those instances and how are you going to operate the software that's running inside of those instances. So this is where Juju comes together again as an open source tool that provides support for both application deployments and post-deployment operations. So trying to sum it up, you can obviously use Terraform, but you have to remember that Terraform provides a support for the initial deployment only.
Yeah, sure. If listeners are interested in OpenStack, is it something that they could just go and pick up and start playing with? And if it is, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so OpenStack deployments are known to be very complex, and I've come through this pain many times in the past as well. So I know how difficult may it be. Like it's always good to deploy OpenStack manually if you are just willing to learn it. But if you want to get it quickly so that you could start experimenting with it, then a manual deployment is definitely not a solution for you. And in fact, many OpenStack distributions that are currently available on the market are not also as easily deployable. So we can ask ourselves a question whether there's any tool that would allow people, developers, to install OpenStack very quickly so that they could get an immediate access. There is a bunch of tools that provide this kind of a value like DevStack or PackStack, but they are not really user-friendly. So is there actually a tool that people could use? So what I wanted to encourage the audience of this podcast to try is what we call MicroStack, which is probably the easiest way to get started with OpenStack. MicroStack is an incubating product at Canonical. It's a snap-based MicroStack installation, which means that you can install it, upgrade it, and remove it with just executing a single command as any other snaps. And if you would be looking for and dedicated installation instructions, you can refer to our website at ubuntu.com/openstack/install, where you will find a step-by-step guide that will walk you through the MicroStack installation process, either in a single node environment or in a small cluster. I think it's the easiest way to get started with OpenStack.
Sure. So we mentioned, or you poked fun at me at the start of the podcast that OpenStack's been around for 10 years, and in my naivety, I haven't come across it. But what do you expect for OpenStack in its next 10 years? What can we look forward to coming onto the platform?
So I think that OpenStack is going to follow the way that other major OpenStack projects have followed in the past, including Linux and Ubuntu. So if you have a look at their evolution, at some point they stopped focusing on bringing like cutting edge technologies and rather focused on improving things like stability security, and interoperability. Actually, these are kind of like self-driving projects now, and they are heading into their own direction with a very clearly defined mission. And I believe this is exactly what's going to happen with OpenStack. Concluded, it's become a de facto standard for implementing private clouds. We can expect a wider adoption of OpenStack as well. We see OpenStack being adopted by leading telecommunication service providers, big enterprises, but there's also opportunity for OpenStack at the edge, with the entire edge computing trend, where the cloud is going to become available closer to the end user compared to the old approach when it was hosted in the big data center. There is a more and more space for OpenStack adoption in the following years.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it sounds really good. And as I pointed out a couple of times, it's not something I was aware of. And when I've looked at different cloud options for clients of mine, it's not even something I'd ever thought about doing. Going with any sort of private cloud. So it's definitely something to think about for future projects. But it's been interesting. It's been really good talking to you, and that sort of wraps things up for today, I think. So it just leaves me to say thank you for coming on and talking to me today.
Thank you very much, James. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everybody out there for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Tytus Kurek talking about OpenStack. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.